America, it's time for some straight talk. You love your phone. Look at you. You hardly put it down. But you don't love that expensive wireless plan, do you? So what if I told you can keep that phone, network, and number 2 for a lot less? Well, this is me telling you. It's time to switch to Straight Talk, guys. Bring your own phone and get unlimited plans starting at just $45 a month on America's largest, most dependable 4G LTE networks. Straight Talk Wireless. Only at Walmart.
Savings may vary. Please refer always to the latest terms and conditions of service at straighttalk.com.
The hits, they just keep on coming. The NBA offseason has more than made up for everything the playoffs lacked in drama and chaos and intrigue. Chris Paul is a rocket. The reasons why are fascinating, and Paul George may be headed to town right behind him. Mike Golic Jr. is in the chair this morning, and this is going to be a lot of fun. And I want to start with a question that has been sort of rattling around in my mind over the course of the last couple of weeks, and that is, Mike, have we now reached a point in sports where the most interesting times of the calendar year are the times when the games themselves are not being played?
Absolutely, especially in the NBA. The NBA teams to me right now are like a bunch of drunk toddlers trying to put together a puzzle. Because they're just grabbing the biggest, best pieces they can get and trying to jam them together in ways that don't seem to make sense right now. Maybe the picture becomes clearer when more of the pieces fall into place, but right now that's the entertainment value, is watching them all slug away to try and get to the Golden State mountaintop.
For the two separate thoughts I have on that analogy, one of them is I absolutely love it. The second is we probably could lose either half of it. Like, I don't know that we want drunk toddlers. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well,
you could have just toddlers in general who probably are just grabbing the biggest piece that they see.
Yes, they could.
And then, or just, drunk people who.
Could be. For some reason, the combination of words right there was really pleasing, made a ton of sense in my head. Now I realize probably kind of reprehensible when you throw that out there to a normal, polite society.
And yet I loved it, and it probably does make all the sense in the world. And there is a fear that I have with this, though. Look, we have this fabulous arms race that is going on now in the NBA, where it started with the Miami Heat and LeBron. I understand there have been super teams before. I understand that people want to say, hey, LeBron, there were super teams in the 60s, but that was a totally different concept in every conceivable way. The way those teams were constructed, the way it worked out, and the fact that one team wound up being great did not make them a super team. I have created my own new definition of super team. Your father and I actually argued over the semantics of this far longer than we should have.
No, I heard. I was made fully aware of that argument, so I'm glad you guys hashed that out.
Which side of that do you fall on, by the way? Because to me, there are two separate things. There's a super team, and then there's a super team. The Boston Celtics of the 60s, led by Bill Russell, were a super team. They were the greatest team of all time relative to their competition. No one will ever do what they did. Even these Warriors aren't going to do what those teams did. To me, the concept of the super team is in the construct. The super team to me is where, like, you're into superheroes and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, so they all come together on purpose, right? They look at each other and say,
you put together the Avengers. That's a super team. You bring all of these outside heroes together from all the different narrative parts, and you make them a super team.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Now, if someone was actually, like, drafting them and constructing them from free agency separately from them, that wouldn't fit my definition. My definition is they're choosing to come together.
Yes, they're choosing to come together. Perfect superhero analogy for you. Think of the Avengers versus the Fantastic Four. They were all there when the radiation hit them at the same time when you're the Fantastic Four. You became that group together. That was natural, as unnatural as getting hit with space radiation is.
Right, exactly. So that was which one again? The Fantastic Four?
That was Fantastic Four.
So the Bulls of the 90s and the Celtics of the 80s and the Lakers of the 80s and the Spurs of you want to call it the last 20 years. Those teams were the Fantastic Four. I'm talking about the Avengers, teams that put themselves together. And so that's LeBron and the guys in the Heat. And then the Warriors have now taken that to an even bigger level. And now the Rockets are trying to compete with that. And I can't blame them at all. You have two choices in the NBA right now. You can roll over or you can try and make a move. So the Rockets are going for it. My concern is, how close are we right now, Mike Golic Jr., to having 4 teams in the NBA that have all of the good players, and everybody else is the Washington Generals?
I think we're pretty close to that, but I think it's what's happened throughout the entire history of the NBA. And watching that 30 for 30, the best of enemies, was enlightening to me as someone who didn't live through those eras of basketball, of just seeing the way that teams have always tried to sort of fudge the rules in favor of what they can do to make themselves the best, and then everyone else adjusts. It's called the Red Queen theory in evolution, that you're essentially running in the same, you have to keep running faster to get to the same place in order to just keep up with everyone else. And that's the NBA arms race right now. We'll get to that point where you've got larger collections of talent, and it'll even everything out. Water will find its level, so to speak. In all of this, it's just that right now we're at that zenith. We're at that first one through the wall where it seems like this is an impossible thing to overcome, and it's going to be doom and gloom on the other side. The rules have been constantly changing in the NBA. Everyone's just figuring out the best way to keep up with that.
I get it, and I don't blame anybody for doing it. Their job is to do the best they can to win. Adam Silver and his office's job is to figure out a way to maintain some level of competitive balance. And the one thing that you didn't see in that I can tell anyone who wasn't old enough to have been around in the 80s and watched it, and the Celtics and the Lakers were the dominant teams, no question, but Julius Erving on the Sixers wasn't trying to figure out a way to get to Boston. And Bernard King on the Knicks wasn't trying to figure out a way to get to Los Angeles. And all the guys on the Lakers weren't trying to recruit George Gervin away from San Antonio. Do you know what I mean? There were still great players spread out across the league, and those teams just were the best of a group of good teams, as opposed to all of the players are either now going to be on Golden State, San Antonio, Houston, and Cleveland, or they'll be trying to figure out a way to get to Golden State, Cleveland, San Antonio, and Houston.
And I'd say the counter to that is still some of what we saw early in this NBA playoffs. I mean, Memphis, they're devoid of a lot of traditional superstars, but they made a compelling series early in this playoffs against the San Antonio Spurs. I'd argue, again, the NBA made Milwaukee interesting during the NBA playoffs, and you can thank Giannis for that. But that's still a compelling superstar in that market. You've got the Sixers and the Timberwolves right now in less traditional, less big markets that at least have compelling stars. You talk about the interest in the offseason. It's that we've got huge names all over the place in the NBA. And those teams might not be competitive, but right now we're peddling in hope. That's what we do in the offseasons. That's why they're great.
Right.
So you've got hope in Philadelphia and Minnesota and Milwaukee and all these places that they might just be tangent to a Cleveland Cavaliers team with LeBron James that's finally showing a little bit of a crack in the armor.
Yeah, actually, Philadelphia and Minnesota, I think, have legitimate reason for hope. And that is good news. Let's see if they're able to keep those teams together. All right, let's start it with off the top here. Mike Golic Jr. with you today. And the Rockets have acquired Chris Paul from the Clippers in exchange for 7 players and draft picks and money going back and forth. And we'll get more deeply into this in a second here, Mike. But the bottom line of it is Chris Paul wanted out of L.A. And the reasons why, we're going to hear from one of our SportsCenter colleagues here, they could wind up being very interesting.
Yeah, it's more of the melodrama that we've come to expect from the NBA as far as what you get on the court. You get to pair him up with the runner-up in the MVP in James Harden, who was all-time in usage this year. Now, James Harden and Chris Paul will be 2 of the only 4 players in the NBA, including LeBron James and Kevin Durant, to be named first-team All-NBA in at least 3 times in the last 6 seasons. So that's the kind of firepower you've got mounting up in Houston, and we hear that they might be in the market to add even more.
Right, exactly right. They may be going after Paul George coming up next. Paul led the Clippers to a winning record and a playoff appearance in all 6 of his seasons in Los Angeles. In the 27 seasons the Clippers played before he got there, they made the playoffs only 4 times. And they have the worst winning percentage in the NBA. A lot of people, Mike, like to knock Chris Paul because he's never gotten out of the second round, and they use that to try to diminish his greatness. He has numbers, regular season at least numbers, that suggest he's one of the greatest point guards that ever lived. Where do you fall on that spectrum between he's completely overrated, his teams never win in the playoffs, or his numbers suggest he's one of the greatest players ever?
I tend to side with the numbers just because I think a lot of times in team sports we use results too much as the metric for judging success and how good someone is as a player. And so I never had any problem with Chris Paul. My question is now, as the Clippers look to lock up Blake Griffin in the wake of all of this, is he enough on his own? Is Blake Griffin a guy that you can legitimately build around in today's NBA? And I just don't think so.
Right. I think, unfortunately, there isn't any one player with the super teams we're talking about that you could build around, with the possible exception of LeBron James, and as we saw this year, maybe even he is not enough.
Off the top.
All right, Aaron Judge hit another home run last night, his 27th of the season as the Yankees beat the White Sox 12-3. He's 1 home run shy of tying Mark McGwire's record for most home runs by a rookie through the end of June. Let me ask you this question, Mike Golic Jr. Is there anything in baseball right now that makes you stop what you're doing and pay attention more than Aaron Judge coming to the plate.
No, and it's the best thing possible for the sport. I said I miss the era that I grew up in baseball that had Mark McGwire and Sosa and Barry Bonds, and all of these guys were cutting into the broadcast of these games, and you were making an appointment viewing, and I did that for the first time in a long time the other night because I knew Judge was up to bat, and you have the chance to see something legitimately great and awe-inspiring every time this guy is on your screen.
In the late, I'm just doing the math in my head, in the late 90s you would have been 10, 11, 12-ish years old. So the McGwire, Sosa, Bonds, home run.
The steroid era was the heart of my childhood in baseball.
And that's what you, in your mind, that's what baseball is, right? That's what you grew up with. That's what you expected to be, and you liked it.
I got a home run race. I had Barry Bonds chasing the all-time record. I had all of these things that are now looked back on with a little bit of a side eye, a wink and a nudge, but that were the foundation of my baseball fandom. And I feel like coming into it from that to where we've been lately has been a bit of a letdown.
Well, you want home runs?
Off the top.
I got one for you. Tim Tebow hit one last night. Homered in his second game with the St. Lucie Mets. How closely, if at all, are you following Tebow's progress in the minor leagues?
Not closely at all, but it's one we know anytime something like this comes up, he's going to make the news because he's that polarizing a star. We talk about this with the NBA stars. He's a guy that's a legitimate, proven commodity as far as a household name. Is there any way we can petition for him in the home run derby? Could you imagine Judge, Giancarlo Stanton, and Tim Tebow coming to a derby near you?
That's a very, very good idea. Get Rob Manfred on the phone, Hembo. Let's get that done. And finally, speaking of baseball, Miguel Montero, designated for assignment, sent down by the Mets after he gave up 7 stolen bases the other night and then very publicly blamed his pitcher. He did say he called Jake Arrieta to apologize, and Arrieta's response was basically, hey, man, heat of the moment, we're all good here. Give me a quick take on what you heard from Montero the other day and your thoughts on him getting sent down.
Well, I think Anthony Rizzo, who went on later and commented on air calling it selfish, was absolutely right. Catcher's one of those positions, and I'd almost liken it to offensive line, where no one wants to hear about your problems. And you're not there to complain about your problems. That's one of the positions that you have the closest proximity to the money. You're closest to the pitcher, you're closest to the quarterback, you're closest to the goalie, wherever you are. You're there to be the meat shield, as I've often said. And that's both in a literal sense and in this sense right here, where you're asked to stand up and sometimes take the blame for things that aren't your fault. And when you balk from that model, you look petty. You look exactly like this has looked.
That's very well put.
Off the top.
That's a very good analogy. And that's Off the Top with Mike and Mike. It's what everyone's talking about. Brought to you by O'Reilly Auto Parts. Better parts, better prices every day. It's a good analogy to the offensive line, which, of course, for those who don't know, Mike Golic Jr., this was a position that you played at Notre Dame. And the reason that I think of that is I remember there was a playoff game where Peyton Manning got sacked multiple times. I forget what it was. They lost a tough game, a game they were favored to win back when he was in Indianapolis. And after the game, it sounded like he kept referring to, well, we were having trouble in protection and we were having difficulty with the blitz. And it sounded like he was throwing his offensive line under the bus. And everyone came to his defense. Everyone came and said, no, he's talking about himself as well. He's putting himself in with the group. If an offensive lineman were to say similar things, well, Peyton was having trouble picking up the reads, Peyton was having trouble getting us in the right places, whatever the case may be, the world would have come down on them very differently.
Exactly. It's my personal vendetta now as a former offensive lineman to point out inaccuracies in protection when it's brought up on broadcast, because a lot of time people attribute sacks to the offensive line that don't belong there. Running backs and tight ends are involved in protection. As you mentioned, the quarterback plays a role in setting that a lot of times. But that's for you once you're done. When you're in that role, you go up there and you assume blame for the things. You talk about it in the sense of we, because it's a collective. And usually even err on the side of I. If Miguel Montoya got up there and said, you know what, I have to wear that as the catcher, the buck stops with me. It's my job to go out there and cover up for those things when they come up, and I have to assume that. That's what you're asked to do, because when it comes out on the other side, you're right. Even if you're right, even in the truest part of this, if you are correct in what you're saying, it's never going to come off that way. It's always going to be sour grapes.
I agree. And we did a thing yesterday, and I'm not sorry that we did it. Hembo went in there with a stopwatch, and he's timing the move to the plate all night long and coming up with how many of the steals, and I think he just likes doing that stuff, but how many of the steals were and weren't Montero's fault. And my feeling was it's a delightful exercise, but it's an irrelevant waste of time, because regardless of whether he's right or wrong, to the point that you are making, he shouldn't have said it either way. You don't say that even if he's 100% right. Even if Arrieta doesn't let go of the ball until the runner has already begun his slide into second At that point, Montero has to take the blame.
Exactly. Even if the running back completely whiffs, it's my job to say, you know what, I could have gotten him help. I could have been there late. I could have done something. We have to do a better job overall holding up and making sure we keep that clean. He has to do a better job here of making sure they don't give up 7 stolen bases in a night.
We're Mike and Mike. We're presented by Progressive Insurance. Last year, over 3 million drivers switched to Progressive. Call or click today. Find out if you could save. This may be an impossible question, and today definitely isn't the day to get into it. We'll get to Chris Paul in a second. But roughly speaking, what percentage of sacks in a football game, major college football or an NFL game, are the simple product of a defensive lineman beating an offensive lineman, one-on-one blocking, and I'm the D lineman, you're the O line, I just beat you when I get to the quarterback, versus some kind of mistake, whether it's, you were supposed to get him, no, I was supposed to get him, no, the back was supposed to get him, no, the quarterback didn't have the right protection sliding the right way. Can you give a rough percentage of that?
I'd still say about half, because that's what football comes down to at the end of the day, is man versus man, me versus you. Now, there are other intricacies in that, but for the most part, it is that. But you will see, and it's usually very apparent when there is that miscommunication, when there is someone sliding the wrong way, when there is someone just blatantly blowing an assignment in a game. Usually those are the obvious ones. When it looks like it, when it smells like it, those are the obvious instances. But the rest of the time, protection is designed to give everyone help. That's the basis of team sports. You're designed to give everyone help somewhere, usually with the exception of one guy. And for the longest time, it was your left tackle. In a lot of instances, it can be your right guard. Those are the places where you usually see those one-on-one wins for a defensive lineman, because that's by design. All
right, Mike and Mike. Mike Golic Jr. in for Dad today. We got a lot to get to. Let's start with Chris Paul. He's on his way to Houston, where the Rockets are building a super team. That's what's going on here. Now, these guys... You could argue that this doesn't meet my definition because the Rockets engineered a trade here, but let's face it, this was Chris Paul deciding he wanted to go to Houston, going to the Clipper front office and saying, I'm going to go to Houston. Your best move here is to sign me, trade me there, and get something back as opposed to getting nothing back. So while you wake up this morning and you read the Clippers traded Chris Paul to Houston, do not be confused. This was CP3 and James Harden deciding they wanted to play together. Chris Paul had the ability and the leverage to get himself there, and that's what he did.
And to me, this is the most incredible part of this offseason, the last few offseasons with Kevin Durant, with everything LeBron James has engineered, is how much power these guys are going to continue to wield, because now they've all realized it. Now they all get that they have the ability to control all this. Chris Paul, better than anyone, is the head of the PA. He understands the inner workings of all this at a very intimate level. And so going forward, how much power are teams going to give these guys as you look in the new world order of the NBA? That's the interesting part. You've got the Doc Rivers that do both. You've got guys that have been coach and team president or coach and GM and all this stuff. When do we start seeing the players have a little more of those chips at the table?
Well, here's the bottom line. The NBA superstar, the really genuine A-level player in the National Basketball Association right now, with the possible exception of quarterbacks in the NFL, a handful of quarterbacks, are invaluable on a level that no other athlete is, because they make everything happen. They make the winning happen. They make the box office happen. They make the television ratings happen. And in individual sports, you have people like that as well. We used to talk about the Tiger effect on television broadcasts. Yep. But those are, by nature, individual sports. Within team sports, a guy like Aaron Judge, for example, has set the world on fire. Clayton Kershaw, there'll be a little more of a walk-up on the nights that he's pitching versus other nights. But generally speaking, the game is not being totally changed by their presence. LeBron James, Kevin Durant, Chris Paul, you know the names. These guys, their power, the significance that they have within the sport is almost incalculable. You can't pay them enough money, no matter how much it is you're paying them. If you actually tried to figure out what LeBron James is worth, you would still be counting the money before you got
Well, and that's why we always talk about the way to stop the super team model is to remove that ceiling of what the top players can earn, because I'm with you. I've always wanted to know, what's that number? If you could really pay LeBron James his quarterback worth on the open market, what kind of price would he fetch? And what would it force you to do with the structure of the rest of your team? Because right now, that player maximum is what's holding all of that back and allowing all of this to be possible.
Right. So maybe the answer to this, if we think it's a problem. Maybe I'd like to phrase the question. I'd like to phrase this instead of in the form of a statement, in the form of a problem. Because if there's one thing I hope I'm doing as I'm getting older is I'm getting a little bit smarter, and I recognize that just because I think something very strongly, maybe I have to recognize at this point that it doesn't make me right. So I feel like I'm sort of the last man standing on this side of the river saying, this is not good. All these guys coming together. Chris Paul going to Houston is not a good thing. It's a bad thing, in my opinion, as a basketball fan, because you are further whittling down the pool of teams and players to choose from to watch that feel meaningful, that feel as though they matter. I believe what has made the NFL one of the unspoken, unsung factors of the enormous growth in popularity in the National Football League is that the weakest link is generally not that weak. You know, it's cyclical. There are always going to be bad teams, but they're not always the same ones. And there aren't only 3 or 4 teams that matter. Peyton Manning played almost his whole career in Indianapolis. Brett Favre played almost his whole career in Green Bay. Small markets, they made them matter. They were the glamour. And I think that matters. If all of a sudden all of these stars are going to just wind up in 5 teams and all the rest of the teams are just totally irrelevant, am I missing something, or is that a bad thing?
I don't see it as nearly a bad thing. Now, again, I come at it from a different place where this has been more in the prime of my sports career, so I've got that natural affinity to it. But I think it's a different version of what we've always had. This always comes up in pay for play in college when people say that the minute you start introducing that to the marketplace, you whittle that down to where only the big-time players are going to be able to influence recruits. And my point is always that ship has sailed. There always have been and will be haves and have-nots. It's just that we had such a clear vision of what that was this year and maybe last year too, that I think all of this talent coming together is a much better thing because you start to bring everyone down to there. And once you can knock Golden State off their perch, once a few more of these teams pop up, I think then you start to see it even back out a little bit.
All right, I'd like to hear from you on that and other things this morning, where Mike and Mike were presented by Progressive Insurance. We're jam-packed this morning on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line, including Teddy Atlas from Australia getting set for the fight and Jeff Van Gundy on all this basketball and a whole lot more. I also thought we could have a little fun this morning with Mike Golic Jr. in for Mike Golic Sr. today. I thought we could just do we'll sprinkle it in as the morning goes on, a little Grill Golic. Let's use the hashtag Grill Golic Jr., Grill Golic Jr., and just throw questions at him. We've done this for years with your dad, and let's do it this morning here. Now, usually with Mike, we would do it with football questions. Today, let's just stay away from sports. Anything you want to ask about growing up as a Golic, anything you want to ask about any of the number of other things, superheroes, which is obviously something that you're very intimately connected with, movies, you know an awful lot about, The Bachelorette, which I know is something you're following closely.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Send them all. Nothing is off limits here. It's like a Reddit AMA happening live on air. It's terrifying.
Anything and everything goes here. So use the hashtag Grill Golic Jr., Grill Golic Jr. We'll do those this morning. We haven't heard from any of the people directly involved in the big move yesterday, but you will. Coming up next.
Greeny, you know how to win at business?
Tell me how.
Show up early for meetings. That way everybody who's only on time looks like slackers.
Well, I got a better way to win at business.
What's that?
Instant free nights at La Quinta Inns and Suites. You can show up with no advance reservation and redeem your La Quinta Returns loyalty points for a free night that same night just by using the La Quinta app.
I feel like I'd win at business more than you.
I'd cream you at business.
Impossible. I'm undefeated at business.
Go to LQ.com now and prepare to win at business. That is Mike Golic Jr. We're having fun here this morning, and among the things we're going to do is we're going to grill Golic here. Grill Golic Jr. Grill Golic Jr. is the hashtag. And ask anything you want. No football questions. It's not football season. Let's just get to know Mikey a little bit here and have some fun in his dad's absence. And I saw this one that came flying in immediately, and you mentioned this is something you hear a lot. It's from Francisco Abarca. And he tweets, "Did your uncle ever introduce you to Kelly Kapowski?"
And I said to you guys, this is the first question I get without fail anytime someone recognizes my last name. This show's been on the air for damn near 2 decades, and it still is your uncle, the guy from the college years, and did he ever get you a date with Kelly Kapowski? And to that I'd say I'm still sitting here single with all of you guys because that didn't happen, and I will never forgive him for that.
So that is what you get asked more than anything else. You played at Notre Dame, you played in the national championship game, your father is Mike Golic for Mike and Mike, and yet you still get asked about Kelly Kapowski.
People hear the last name Golic, and that is far and away the first question I get every single time. Still to this day, blows my mind.
The other question that I saw, and I have a million of them here, that I really liked, because this is just so you, is, in a zombie apocalypse, What is your weapon of choice?
Yeah, this is something that we mull over way too often in the Golic house. I've been petitioning for a bunker for a while now with Mom, and she still won't listen.
Mm-hmm.
But I would go some sort of sword, like a katana blade, something like that, just for close-range combat, because the gun's going to make too much noise. More often than not in zombie movies, the zombies are triggered by loud noises. So you want to keep that hush-hush. You want to be able to get in close to the body in case you're in a horde, you find yourself in a precarious situation. So I would go the sword route. You got to do a little practice. Be ready to wield it the right way.
Anything you're doing with a sword, of course, is wielding. That's the verb of choice. Keep those coming. Grill, Golic, Jr. We're going to hear from Daryl Morey in just a second, who made the big move yesterday. I did just want to make sure I made mention today, for those of you who've not seen the promos or are not aware, I was away for 2 weeks at the beginning of this month shooting a reboot of Battle of the Network Stars. And Mikey and I were talking before the show today. That's something you don't even remember when it was on in the 70s and the 80s. It was a television phenomenon in my childhood. And we're doing a reboot on ABC, and it debuts tonight at 9 Eastern, 8 Central on ABC. And it's a lot of fun. You'll see a lot of television stars, a lot of faces that you will recognize who are current, like Corbin Bleu from High School Musical and Laney from the Goldbergs and Luke from Modern Family, and then a lot of stars who were famous when I was growing up, like two of the members, Tootie and Blair from Facts of Life are on tonight, and Tom Arnold is on tonight, and Dave Coulier is on tonight, and Bronson Pinchot is on tonight. So it's a lot of fun. I hope that people will watch it, and I really hope people will like it. It's 9 Eastern, 8 Central tonight on ABC.
And you mentioned the original right there, paying homage to that. But as I've often pointed out with a lot of different people, and this came up yesterday with Phil Jackson, because I said for some people they will only know of Phil Jackson, the failed president. For some people, Ice Cube is going to be that guy in Ride Along, and for some people, you will be the host of Battle of the Network Stars.
That's fun. I love those people. I would like just to hang around with those people, because the actual host of Battle of the Network Stars and Joe Tessitore and I, who hosted this edition, made our entire week, 2 weeks, into a loving homage to Howard Cosell, which is a name that I know you know the name. Yeah. He's not someone whose significance you probably can fully understand to those of us who were around at the time. But Howard was and will always be the man in that mustard jacket. We just borrowed it for a couple of weeks. Anyway, the show is tonight. Now, back to the sports news of the day. Chris Paul on his way to Houston. Daryl Morey, the aggressive general manager of the Houston Rockets, made that move, and he explained why he felt it's important at this particular time in NBA history to be all in.
In a year where we're going all in, it's important to have more resources. Whereas if you wait till July and you hope to sign Chris later after he has meetings with multiple teams, you don't know how those meetings are going to go. So when the opportunity to trade for him early, we jumped at it, came together quickly. We would have been down to minimums if we signed him in July. So, I think once you're close, and especially chasing these, super teams out there that we're trying to join, you have to keep your resources dry to keep improving the team, because it's not just to have James Harden, it's not just enough to have Chris Paul and Eric and Trevor and the great players we have, but you got to continue to have flexibility to get better again.
So he's talking there in particular about why they made this trade now instead of waiting for free agency and seeing if they could sign him that route. What is your general thought on Chris Paul and James Harden on the floor together with only one ball?
I don't think it'll be enough. I think, again, this is kind of where my analogy of the toddler will remove the drunk portion from the toddler analogy. Jamming puzzle pieces together, because you've got two great players, but especially after what James Harden was able to put together in that Mike D'Antoni offense. And we heard all about Mike D'Antoni saying, I need you to play point guard in this offense. It seemed like a more natural position for him. All of a sudden now, are you going to ask him to go back to that role of shooting guard, as Chris Paul, who really, in my mind, can't be a shooting guard, is only going to be a point guard in all this, comes back into the equation. I just don't know how that translates into you getting over the mountaintop with just these guys.
To me, it's two separate questions there. One of them is, will they be better together? Will you can put you know more about superheroes than I do, but if you put Superman and Aquaman together, their powers might, increase by like a power of 10, right? Like they may somehow magnify each other, or they may just increase by a power of 2. It might be addition, or it might be multiplication. Let's use a much better way of looking at it. The separate question to me is, does this make them good enough to catch Golden State? Let's save that one for later. Let's just start with the two of them together on the floor with their respective skill sets, and again, only one basketball. Do you think they just add up, it's 1 + 1, or do you think they multiply? They become that much better because of the other?
I think this is purely addition, because you don't add a player of that caliber and not get better. Like, that's nonsense. That was the argument we had with Golden State. Does Kevin Durant somehow make them worse because he removes the chemistry? And we saw what a bit of hogwash that was. And so you're still getting better, but it's not that incremental increase, to your point. I don't think you are multiplying this up. This is a 1-to-1 ad for me right now.
Well, Brian Windhorst says 1 + 1 may not be enough, that Daryl Morey and the Rockets may be looking to add another. They may not be done in this offseason. Here's Brian Windhorst.
You've got fallout everywhere. Number one, the Houston Rockets are not done. It's not just Carmelo Anthony. Daryl Morey is going to go and try to get Paul George. He's been trying to work on this deal for the last 2 weeks. His vision is to bring Paul George and Chris Paul in to play with James Harden. Will he be able to do it? His central piece to trade is Indianapolis native Eric Gordon. Is that going to be enough with other pieces? I don't know. But Daryl Morey swings for the fences, and here we have. He's connected on another home run.
The bottom line of it is this. The Indiana Pacers and their general manager, Kevin Pritchard, are in a really tough spot. The worst spot you can be in, which is that everybody knows that you have the sword of Damocles hanging over your head. Paul George is going to leave. You're going to get the best you can for him. And I believe that every day that passes, your offers get less and less attractive. So if Houston puts something on the table today and they bring in Paul George, they probably wind up getting him. So now I'll ask you, James Harden plus Chris Paul, plus Paul George, is that enough to make them a legitimate threat to Golden State?
I think it's enough to make them a legitimate threat to San Antonio, which is the ladder you're trying to climb if you're every team but San Antonio and Cleveland, is trying to just get tangent to one of those groups. And I think that's enough to make that interesting for me, because then once you get there with Golden State, anything can happen. But Paul George is the commodity in today's NBA. He is length at the wing. He can defend. He can be a 3-and-D guy to the umpteenth level like we saw in their playoff series against Cleveland. I think he's more of that exponential increase for them at this point because of need, especially after giving away 7 guys on there. I mean, you heard Daryl Morey just trying to remember who the hell he had on his team at that point. Eric, Trevor, Jack, Tom. Don't look any of these up. They're all here. They're all on the team. Don't worry about it.
And if I mentioned one that I traded away, I apologize in advance.
Okay, keep your eyes closed.
Okay.
I want to show you my first ever painting.
All right.
Okay. Open your eyes.
Oh, that's a lot of colors. And shades.
So be honest. What do you think?
Well, I like how if you switch to Geico, you could save hundreds of dollars on car insurance.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Here, why don't I hold your paintbrush while you call them?
Geico, because saving 15% or more on car insurance is always a great answer.
Talking with Mike Golic Jr. is in for his dad today, and we're grilling Golic Jr. Grill Golic Jr. is the hashtag today. And someone tweeted in the joke, which retreats faster, the French army or your hairline? And one of the things that has sort of remained is that, like, bald jokes are almost the only ones left we can make. Like when your dad and I started this, like, I could joke around about a lot of things with him, and almost all of them now we've become, as a society, sensitive to. And I get it, and I don't want to ever make anybody feel bad. We're just in the spirit of having fun here. But that feels like the one area of humor left that we can mine at this point. And so I'm grateful that you have a sense of humor about it.
The only option I have is to have a sense of humor about it, because if not, I'd be in the fetal position in the corner, because I am the easiest target in the world when it comes to this. I'm 27. I'm single in Central Connecticut, and I am male pattern balding like you know what. It is counterproductive to everything else I am trying to put in play. As much success as I could potentially have, as much as I could sweet talk somebody, I'm still battling against this. I bring hats around everywhere I go for that reason, and it still doesn't always help.
You do have a good head, though, if I may. Like, some people have a head that I think would not look good bald, and I think you have a head. Your head is nicely round, which I think is the key to looking good bald. I know the camera angle they keep showing is extremely unflattering.
No, yeah, I have a good round head. There's not a lot of lumps to it. There's not a bunch of different levels. There's no plateau up there. There's no great plane. It's just a good round head. And Bomani Jones has told me on multiple occasions, on air and through Twitter, to just go ahead and come on home.
Yeah.
And I'm real close at this point, mostly because it just doesn't keep coming back. Like, thankfully, if the facial hair ever stops coming in, I'm going to stop showing up to work because I'll have nothing left to offer anyone. And at that point, if I am still single, my mom is going to have to reconcile with some hard truths.
Keep the tweets
I'm so sorry, Mom.
coming. Hashtag Grill Golic Jr. We'll continue to have fun with this all morning long. All right, back to Houston, where they don't seem to have a problem. Now they've got James Harden and Chris Paul, and they're not done yet. We've talked at great length about their desire to add Paul George. And our Stephen A. Smith jumped into the mix yesterday suggesting there's another superstar who may soon be headed down to Houston.
Carmelo Anthony's going to have to make a decision. He's made an awful lot of money, over $300 million in his career. Does he care about the money or does he care about winning? Now, me knowing Carmelo Anthony the way that I do, I know he cares about both. But I also know that he cares about money more than he cares about anything else. So the first priority for him is making sure that $54 million owed to him, he's going to get that. That's number one. If he gets that but still gets bought out, I believe, based off of what I've heard in the last hour, that he'll end up following CP3 to Houston to join James Harden. That's my personal belief.
Okay, so let's be clear on what we're talking about here. When he's talking about the money, because bear in mind, if he allows himself to be traded, there's actually a trade kicker, so he actually gets more money, not less, and he goes and plays in Houston, which is Texas, which is no state taxes, versus New York, which is, obscene state taxes. So he actually makes money on the deal. The reason Stephen A. is talking about him losing money is, would he accept a buyout at less than the full $54 million that remains in his contract? If the Knicks were going to buy him out, Phil Jackson would still be the president of the Knicks. The ultimate battle between Dolan and Jackson that wound up being the end of that relationship, from what everybody says, and it makes sense, is that Phil basically went to Dolan and said, look, we can't start building this thing until we find a way to move Carmelo. If he will not allow us to trade him, we need to buy him out. And James Dolan said, I can either buy you out for $24 million or I can buy him out for $54 million, and he made that choice. So if Carmelo is willing to allow himself to be traded to Houston, now that opens up that conversation. Mike Golic Jr., do you like the fit of Carmelo in Houston more, less, or equally to Paul George in Houston?
Less. He's older. He's a little more, ball dominant. Dependent on that, he gives you virtually nothing on the defensive end at this point, other than another fresh, warm body out there. So I still think Paul George is the overwhelmingly valued option in that scenario. But again, at this point, you're just jamming puzzle pieces together. So you take what you can get. You're going to get better with Carmelo there. He's still a viable offensive threat. For me, it gets interesting too, because we keep hearing about the family portion of this with Carmelo too, right, that he wants to stay close to his son. We've heard his wife say that, and that drives so many more decisions in the world of sports, whether it's players and coaches, than anyone can possibly account for, because we don't know those things. We don't deserve to know those things. And so if he can overcome that and finally get out of there, I still think that's interesting, but Paul George is the golden goose here.
Correct. I agree with everything you just said, and the reason I put it as Melo or Paul George is because you have to trade to get Paul George, and I don't believe the Knicks are going to buy out Carmelo Anthony, which would mean you'd have to trade to get him too. So I don't think that you get – if the Knicks wind up buying out Carmelo Anthony, then of course anything can happen. Everything goes on the table, and he might wind up in Cleveland. But I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think Carmelo is taking $1 less than the $54 million that he's owed. And guess what? He shouldn't. I wasn't there when they signed that contract, but I've never heard any reports that a gun was to anyone's head. So they signed it willingly. He deserves every cent of that money, and he should get it, and he will. But it remains, people talk about, well, Phil is gone, so Carmelo is happy now. The bottom line of it is, you're still building something from nothing with the Knicks. You want to be young. They're still better off, Mike, trading Carmelo Anthony if they can, right?
Yes, as we've seen, if you're loitering around the basement in the NBA, it's better to just get all the way to the bottom floor before you can start going up again. And that's what they're up against here, because they were bad during this, but even yesterday it was getting rid of Phil Jackson doesn't solve your long-term problems. It's still going to be a bad basketball team for the most part. So I'm with you. That has to happen for them to move forward.
Yeah, and he's could sort of be whatever it is he brings back, it's something. There is no conceivable chance the Knicks are going to accomplish anything of great consequence in the NBA during the remainder of Carmelo Anthony's prime, which seems to be disappearing a little faster than some of his contemporaries because of injuries and the style of his game. So you trade him if he allows you to. Maybe his sort of mano-a-mano battle with Phil will make him a little more inclined to allow himself to be traded, because there won't be an ego clash involved. We'll find out.
Daddy, where do babies come from? Honey?
Mommy went to the store.
Oh, well, you see, there's a mommy and a daddy, right?
Right.
And see, when they call Geico, they could save a bunch of money on car insurance.
Oh, really? And that makes them happy?
Yes, that makes them very happy.
That's good.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we could have this talk, Sunshine.
Geico, because saving 15% or more on car insurance is always a great answer.
Want an easy way to see if you could save money on car insurance? Geico gives you 3. Call 1-800-947-AUTO. Go online to geico.com or stop by the Geico office nearest you. 3 ways you could save 15% or more.
Our very own Michael Eaves, who anchors SportsCenter and is very connected to the LA Clippers organization, and had a Facebook post yesterday with his insight into the relationships behind Chris Paul, Doc Rivers, and maybe the real reason, or at least one of them, why Chris Paul wanted out of L.A. Really interesting. If you didn't read it, you don't want to miss this. He'll be live with us in just a couple of minutes. But Mike Golic Jr. is in for his dad today, and we're having a little fun with a little Grill Golic Jr. The hashtag is Grill Golic Jr., and there's a lot of fun stuff in here, and we'll just sprinkle them in all morning long. Here's one I've long wanted to ask you, like 2-3 years or however long it's been since this happened. Dan wants to know, how terrible was it for you when you had to take the photo when your dad posed for the butt picture?
That was tough. There's still a lot of therapy that Dad's paying for on that one on my behalf. Just because the more scarring moment was coming home that day, knowing I had to take the picture, and just seeing the baby oil on the counter, knowing what that meant, the baby oil and the roller on the counter, and knowing I was going to have to watch my mom oil my dad up, and something that, Dad hints at every chance he gets on this show that's going on behind closed doors. I don't know how often I have to hear that porn track music.
During your childhood, so we started this show, you were 9, 10 years old?
9 years old.
2000? So, we've been making that joke. I would hit that little, for years and years, we knew it as page 10. I don't even know what page it is anymore. We're like 5 arrays later. But we would play that all the time.
Oh, yeah.
And it's one of those things I never really thought about while we were doing it, because our show was so insignificant when we started that I assumed that literally no one was listening. And I wasn't far from right, but you were. So when we would make those kind of jokes, and you and your brother Jake, who's only a year younger than you are, and your sister Sydney, who's a few years younger than that, you're probably in the car on your way to school listening to this.
Oh, I'll give you even better. In the training room at Notre Dame, getting ready for practice, they got the sound on in there, Mike and Mike sometimes in the morning, and all of a sudden, hey, Mike, parents are talking about having sex again on the radio. Oh, a word? Thanks, guys. Now the difference is I can fire back at them and give them some stuff that they don't want to know, and that hits a little closer to home. But, don't think that didn't go unnoticed. Dad, Mom. I shouldn't throw Mom into this. She is someone who's been dragged into this very unceremoniously, but my dad is a complete idiot.
Yeah, she was an innocent victim in that every bit as much as you were. And then Chris, quickly, before we get Michael in here, Chris wants to know, how would you fare blocking your dad in his prime?
Run blocking would have been tough. Pass blocking, you just have to basically exist. We see the highlight all the time with Madden. You just stand there half the time. Stand there and let Reggie
Stand on the line of scrimmage.
Stand there and just let Reggie and Clyde and Jerome and all those guys do the work.
You could have just been in the way. All right, keep those coming. Hashtag Grill Golic Jr. We'll sprinkle them in as the morning continues. We are presented by Progressive Insurance. Pick from a range of coverage options with the Name Your Price tool to find a price that works for you. Okay, as I mentioned, you know now that Chris Paul has, for lack of a better way of putting it, engineered himself a trade. You look at this and you say the transaction reads Chris Paul traded by the Clippers to the Rockets. But that's not really what happened here. What really happened here was Chris Paul worked his way out of L.A. and worked his way to Houston, specifically where he wanted to go. And as I mentioned, our colleague from SportsCenter, Michael Eaves, had fascinating insight into this on a Facebook post yesterday. It got a lot of attention, so we wanted to bring Michael in, as we do here on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line. Michael, it's Mike and Mike Golic Jr. here. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well. What's happening?
Well, you tell us, because you're the one with all the news. Let's let you have the floor here and assume that the people listening to us did not read what you wrote on Facebook yesterday. Take it from the very top. What is your insight into what went on here behind the scenes between Doc Rivers and Chris Paul?
Well, as it pertains to Doc and Chris specifically, what happened was, Greeny, is just over the course of a couple of years, the relationship started to deteriorate, and quite honestly, from Chris Paul's standpoint, his trust and faith in Doc started to go downhill. It started really when Austin Rivers came on board, and that Chris Paul and some of the guys on the team didn't feel as if Austin really tried to be one of the guys, so to speak. They thought he felt a little entitled because his father was the head coach as well as the president of basketball operations, so he knew he was good. He could do no wrong in the face of the organization. And they felt as if Doc didn't address that enough. They also felt specifically timed games or practices that Austin was treated differently than some of the other guys on the team. Now, again, Doc would probably say, no, I'm equal with all the guys, or maybe I'm even harder on my son. But the players didn't feel that way, so they wouldn't see it that way. And then, of course, there was the proposed trade between the Knicks and the Clippers that involved Carmelo Anthony coming to L.A. along with Sasha Vujacic in exchange for Jamal Crawford, Paul Pierce, and Austin Rivers. I was told that the Knicks gave the Clippers about a 3-day window to respond and, come up with some type of deal if they didn't like what was on the table. Doc didn't respond within that timeline. No, deal's off the table, we're not going to negotiate. Now, maybe Doc was trying to play hardball with the Knicks because they knew they were in a tough position with Phil talking about Carmelo Anthony so much publicly. He tried to get something out of him. He called their bluff, and they pulled the deal. But in the eyes of Chris Paul and some of the players, they felt that Doc was more concerned with keeping Austin Rivers on the team than he was improving the team's chances and going to the Western Conference Finals. So that's how they felt, and that was just an example of all the things going on internally where Chris just didn't see Doc Rivers as a coach to get him to the conference finals, a place he's never been, or even as the head coach or president of basketball operations in both capacity. He lost faith in the organization as a whole. He wanted to go elsewhere.
And Michael, are there any specific instances of the things that you referenced with Doc and Austin Rivers, like specific examples of the ways that guys thought he was treated differently or wasn't holding up his end of the bargain?
Yeah, I mean, I can't point to one particular game where you can see evidence or in a practice, but what would happen was, let's say, I don't want to throw out a name, let's just say a guy on a team misses assignment on a pick and roll or didn't get back on defense or something, typical stuff that coaches get on players about. And they would get criticized. But the players felt as if oftentimes Austin Rivers would do something very similar, but not get treated in a similar fashion by Doc. They felt that way. And again, when you see a guy that comes in and his dad's the coach, you automatically, whether you want to or not, we are human beings and we can't prevent our emotions from being what they are sometimes. You think that this guy's going to be treated differently, right? So you're looking for every opportunity when he is. Now, one thing you could go back and look at now, Mike, in terms of, hindsight being 2020, there were a couple of games several times last year where Austin Rivers would go to the floor, where, he dove for a loose ball or got fouled or something. And there were times when players didn't go to pick him up. In today's NBA, if a guy goes to the floor, there's 3 guys running to go pick him up. It's like the new cool thing to do. It looks like you're all about a team. There were a couple of times where Austin Rivers got up by himself. And what I was told from a couple of people I spoke to, that was indicative of how the team felt about him during certain times last year.
Mike and Michael Eaves again with interesting insight into what's going on with the Clippers. And so Doc Rivers talked yesterday, and I don't know if he was directly addressing your comments in your Facebook post or not, but he, of course, was saying that none of that is the case and that his relationship with Chris Paul was fine and that Chris Paul just wanted to go play with Chris Harden. And so I just want to make sure what I'm understanding you to say here is that both of those could theoretically be true, that in Doc Rivers' mind, he may have thought everything was fine, and maybe he doesn't think he treats his son any differently, but that in Chris Paul's mind, that perception became reality. And whether the truth is somewhere in the middle or not, that's the way Chris Paul felt.
Exactly. And Greeny, oftentimes the truth is always in the middle.
Right.
But those were the feelings that Chris Paul and some of the other players had. It just led I'm not saying that's the reason he left specifically. What I'm saying is that relationship made Chris start to look at his organization differently and then maybe look at other places for him to go. Now, Doc is right. Chris Paul did want to go play with James Harden. And that's why, as you just said, it was Chris engineered this move for the Clippers to send him to Houston. Now, this was all part of a master plan by Chris Paul in terms of where he wanted to go play, which he played it brilliantly in terms of a player exercising the power that he has. So, yeah, all of that is true, Greeny, but the relationship between Chris Paul and Doc Rivers, and more specifically how Chris Paul viewed Doc Rivers, changed drastically over the last couple of years. And the irony, of course, is Chris Paul was all about Doc Rivers coming to L.A. to replace Vinny Del Negro after he left Boston. And remember, the Clippers gave up a first-round draft pick to get Doc Rivers. But you don't know what you have until you have it. And eventually, Chris Paul realized that Doc Rivers wasn't the guy he wanted. I mean, there was a league exec who told me, quote, Chris Paul despises Doc Rivers. That's strong wording.
It's really strong, and you mentioned this was kind of the sentiment throughout the rest of the team. What do you see as the future going forward now that one of your best players, arguably your best player, just left for this reason? You've got a bunch of guys left that he's trying to make it work, and a coach that, when he was in Boston, didn't want to stick around and be part of a rebuild. How much longer do we think this marriage between Doc and the Clippers has left?
Well, that's a good question on a couple fronts. One, we don't know because we don't know who's going to be the leader of that ball club. I mean, Chris Paul wasn't just the best player on the team. He's the best player in the history of the franchise, and he's the best leader it's ever seen. What he did in terms of turning that franchise around, not only from a perennial playoff team, but to a relevant team across the NBA, could not go overstated. He was everything for that organization, inside that locker room specifically. Now you have a core. The core of that group really is Blake Griffin, Jamal Crawford, and DeAndre Jordan, right? None of those three guys are what we would consider leaders of a championship contending team. And that's not a knock on them. That's just not who they are. It's not who they've ever been called to be since they've been in the NBA. So for Doc Rivers' future, and as well as the team as a whole, who do you bring in to be that guy? Who do you bring in to head up this restructuring of your roster going forward in terms of what it's going to do on the court? That's a big question for them. And going back to Doc specifically, I'll say this. When he left Boston after winning a championship and taking the Celtics to another NBA Finals, he was in a different position. Like, he was probably too good, had too much stature to do a rebuild. But what is his stature right now? I mean, that championship was 9 years ago, right? When you think of Doc Rivers now, you think of a guy who couldn't get Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan to the conference finals in the West, even though they were up 3-1 against the Rockets with home games that should have closed it out. So he's in a different position now than he was when he was leaving Boston before he came to L.A.
It's a good point. That was the original 3-1. Mike and Mike were presented by Progressive Insurance. Michael Eaves from SportsCenter with great insight into the situation with the Clippers. And I find all this really curious because they just brought Jerry West there. You bring Jerry West in and you think, all right, he's the guy who's going to go out and recruit LeBron. LeBron and Chris Paul are such good friends. All of that kind of adds up together, and now Chris Paul leaves. So what role does Jerry West play in all of this and shaping whatever the future of the Clippers turns out to be?
Greeny, you could also make the argument that them doing that, bringing in Jerry West to go pursue LeBron James, is indicative of how much Doc Rivers didn't realize how his relationship with Chris Paul had changed, right? Because Chris Paul's family loves Los Angeles. His brother, who serves as his manager, has a couple of kids. They bought a house there. Chris has a house there. His parents have a house there as well. They go back and forth between North Carolina and L.A. He did not want to leave. So what would happen? What would have to happen in order for Chris to engineer a move to Houston? If I'm the organization, if I'm Steve Ballmer specifically, how did this happen? We can't allow it again. Now, to get to your question specifically, I think the one thing that Jerry West can do with Doc Rivers and Lawrence Frank is he can teach them or help them manage assets. No one was better at that in terms of an NBA exec than Jerry West, going back to his days with the Lakers and also what he did with the Memphis Grizzlies specifically. They have a lot of assets now because they got 7 players in a trade, they got a little bit of money, and they got a 2018 first-round draft pick. All right, how do you take that and make a move to get the guy that we were just talking about? Who's going to be the leader of this team? Who's going to be the superstar that you can count on in the last 3 minutes of a game to give you a W and keep going up the ranks for a playoff contender? That's the question, and that's what Jerry West has to do for this team. Doc Rivers has not shown in history been able to do that since he's been the president of basketball operations. Jerry West has done it his entire lifetime.
Yeah, the timing of all of that, to me, is the most interesting piece in all of it. And so let me ask you one last thing, because you know that some of the guys involved, at least in the case of Chris Paul, pretty well. There's a school of thought, I sort of subscribe to it, my partner Mike Golic Jr. does not at all, that the 4 best friends, the 4 amigos, which is LeBron and Carmelo and Chris Paul and Dwayne Wade, have it in their heads that at some point before it's all said and done, they want to play together. I would have thought that L.A. would have been a really logical place for that to happen, and so Chris Paul's departure puts a little bit of a monkey wrench in that. But now we're hearing about maybe Melo going down there. How would you assess the likelihood that those guys are able to engineer a way of at some point all winding up on the same team?
Honestly, Greeny, I don't think it affected negatively at all. In fact, I think it increased his chances, and I'll tell you why. Because Chris Paul will be in the exact same position next summer that he was this summer, an opportunity to sign a max deal, 5 years, $200+ million with Houston, or a 4-year deal worth a little bit more than $150 with someone else. He will still have that opportunity next year. But what now he has in front of him, along with LeBron James, they can pretty much go wherever they want. If he had signed the max deal with the Clippers, the only place LeBron could have joined him was the Clippers. Let's say he signed a 5-year deal with the Clippers and they did a sign and trade with Houston. The only place LeBron could have joined him is Houston. If it doesn't work out with James Harden and Chris Paul on the court, which is a valid question, and Chris Paul will have one season to know if he can do it with James Harden or not, then he and LeBron can team up and go wherever they want. And a place they can go, Greeny, is back to Los Angeles. They could go to the Lakers next summer. Mm-hmm. The two of them could go because the Lakers are having enough cap money. And let's say, for sake of argument, Steve Ballmer gets rid of Doc Rivers as head coach and president of basketball operations. You got Jerry West there. I think Chris Paul and LeBron James wouldn't have a problem going back to Jerry West, provided they hire the right coach. So anything is still possible despite Chris Paul getting the straight. It's just a one-year deal. It's just a one-year deal.
It's a really good point. And all four of those guys will likely be free agents on July 1st of next year. Chris Paul opted in, so as you just described, he'll have that opportunity. Carmelo has a player option to become a free agent. Dwayne Wade has 1 year left on his current deal, and LeBron James has a player option to become a free agent. I continue to say I think that's a real possibility. And, Michael, this was terrific. Excellent insight, and we really appreciate the time this morning. Thanks so much. We'll see you soon.
Hey, no problem, guys. Take care.
You too. That's Michael Eaves with us from SportsCenter with really good insight into a little bit of the background and the history and the relationships internally with that. So there's a lot there to unpack. Let's try and do it. Let's start with those relationships. I don't know how, again, you were a player, I'm not. That notion that I can see where Doc Rivers might get up there and say, no, I didn't treat my son any differently. I didn't view him any differently. And he may mean that. He may genuinely believe that. And Chris Paul might have They might have both seen an incident, whatever it might have been, with completely different eyes. Doc Rivers saw it one way, Chris Paul saw it another way. Neither one is necessarily right or wrong, but perception becomes reality. Does that make sense to you?
Well, especially perception within the realm of nepotism, which is something that I have a little bit of experience with myself, sitting in this chair right now. I mean, we've been doing the Grill Golic all morning, and I just got one that's obviously meant as a slight, but has Golic Jr. done or achieved anything on his own, or has it all come by riding his dad's coattails? And that's the perception that you have to overcome. And if you're Austin Rivers, you have to go in there and almost redouble those efforts to show that that's not the same. I mean, walking in the building here, I had people I know I've talked to who I've worked with who came in and had that viewpoint of me. And then you have to go in and you're constantly battling against that. And so if Austin Rivers, it sounds like to Michael Eaves' point, didn't go out of his way and maybe even went the other way a little bit in this, then that's obviously just going to feed into a mentality that was probably already there to begin with. The minute they made that signing, everyone probably rolled their eyes in that locker room and said, all right, here we go with this.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I'll give you another quick analogy to it. When Brian Schottenheimer was the offensive coordinator of the Jets, I spent an evening with him one time just through like a charitable thing, and I was chatting with him, and he kept referring to his father as Marty. And at one point I said to him, it's interesting that you call your father Marty as opposed to Dad. And he said, when he first put me on his staff, I decided that when I'm going to be in that room, he was a low-level assistant, but he was an assistant coach, and he wanted to be viewed as a coach. And he said, if I were in meetings, and I was like, Dad, I suggest we do this, they're going to view me in a different way. And so I just started calling him Marty, and it kind of stuck. So I understand where that kind of stuff works. So I don't know but Doc Rivers getting up there yesterday and saying, no, that's not the way things were, he's not necessarily lying. He may have viewed it one way, and Paul may have seen it another way. Now let's move to the really interesting piece. I am of the opinion that the guys will be known as the banana boat friends because of the famous picture. But Chris Paul and the four guys who got up at the start of last year's ESPYs and all of that, they're genuinely good friends. They genuinely have big picture interests that go well beyond basketball. I really believe that we will see the four of them unite like the Avengers.
Yes.
At some point, and next year could be that year. Do you think it'll happen?
I think it'll happen. We see all the stars aligning in a way that makes it really enticing. I just don't think that translates into anything meaningful. Like with those guys at the stage they are in all of their careers at this point, you put them all together, and I'm not sure that's a championship contending team the way it's presently constructed. So that's the one issue, is especially if you're LeBron James, because he is the most outside of maybe Chris Paul to gain or lose in all this in the legacy conversation. Does he want to seriously push for another championship, or does he want to play with his friends?
I don't know. That's the same argument that your father made, and I should have mentioned that Michael Eaves was on the Shell Pennzoil Performance line, taking synthetic motor oil performance to a whole new level, make the switch to Pennzoil Synthetics today. I don't think they view it that way, and especially when you look at Dwayne Wade will be in a situation where he can play, if he wants to, for comparatively little money. Carmelo could be in a position, if he wants to play for comparatively little money. They could take deals where they don't have to be the only four guys on the team. I mean, Dwayne Wade, if he's the fifth best player on your team, is still a ridiculously good player. If LeBron's your best player and Chris Paul's your second best player, and then Dwayne Wade and Carmelo Anthony are just pieces of the puzzle, and there are other pieces, I'm just making this up, but whatever LeVar, my goodness. Lonzo Ball turns out to be, or Brandon Ingram turns out to be, or you take those two guys and you turn them into someone else that fits nicely with the four amigos. I think they're going to do it. I really believe you're going to see it happen.
I think you would need that kind of shot of youth and athleticism, especially on the wings, because, again, that's the currency of the new NBA. That's where we've seen Golden State really exploit advantages, and that's what LeBron is desperately needed to help him along the way.
Greeny, you know how to win at business?
Tell me how.
Show up early for meetings. That way everybody who's only on time looks like slackers.
Well, I got a better way to win at business.
What's that?
Instant free nights at La Quinta Inns and Suites. You can show up with no advance reservation and redeem your La Quinta Returns loyalty points for a free night that same night just by using the La Quinta app.
I feel like I'd win at business more than you.
I'd cream you at business.
Impossible. I'm undefeated at business.
Go to LQ.com now and prepare to win at business. We got a lot working here today. Keep the grills coming, and we're having a lot of fun. But, of course, this is a huge weekend on ESPN. As you've no doubt been hearing in the lead-up to this, we have a major fight from Australia, and our buddy Teddy Atlas is down there in Brisbane for Manny Pacquiao and Jeff Horn. You'll see the fight with coverage starting Saturday night, 9 Eastern on ESPN. So huge, big-time boxing on ESPN, not on pay-per-view. And Teddy is with us. Good morning, Teddy.
Hey, good morning, guys.
Of course, it isn't morning where you are.
How are you?
It's 7:30 at night where you are.
No, it's not.
I appreciate you playing along with me.
It's actually 9. For you guys, anytime. It's actually 9:30 at night where I am.
Okay,
off by a couple hours.
There in Brisbane, yeah. So, all right, one way or another. Let's get down to business here. So we're going to see Pacquiao. We're going to see Jeff Horn. Let's start with Pacquiao, who, of course, is going for his 60th career victory and is one of the great stars in the recent history of the sport. For those who haven't seen him fight since Mayweather, what have you seen in him in his return, and what do you think that we should lead us to expect for Saturday night?
He's a little more deliberate. He's a little bit more conservative and thoughtful about his approach. He's not, the seek and destroy missile that's always coming forward. In some ways, he's a better boxer because he is more cerebral. But he still has the really great combination of speed and power, just a great athleticism that very few athletes ever get, whether it's in my sport of boxing or baseball, football, basketball. You depend on technique. You depend on the mental outlook, the mental, part of it, controlling your emotions. But very few people just have a God-given special amount of speed and power to the level that Manny Pacquiao has. I mean, he is just, he's very fast, very powerful, and when you think about the speed, you think about the hands, but his legs are very quick too. So, just a tremendous amount of physical athletic ability to go along with great experience and to go along with the toughness. Sometimes you see the athletes that have that kind of God-given ability, and there's not a lot of them, but they don't have the mental toughness. He has that too, and a lot of that has to do with coming from the country he comes from. I mean, when you grow up as poor as he grew up, and as many difficult situations as he saw as a kid, usually that will breed character and internal toughness, and it has with Manny Pacquiao.
And Teddy, on the other side, you've got Jeff Horn, who's a rising star in Australia, but for some of us who are parachuting in for this fight and maybe meeting him for the first time, what's the book on this 29-year-old kid?
Yeah, real gritty. What you expect from the Outback. I mean, I'm not being cheekish or, trying to be funny or anything, but this country is full of tough men. and outdoorsmen, athletes, people that consider themselves, tough people and that live that kind of outdoors life. A real gritty guy and a down-to-earth guy. The interviews I've heard him, a very easy guy to like. Good personality, very humble, but also understands a little bit like Manny in some ways, believe it or not, that he represents, in this case, he's representing part of a country. Manny represents the Philippines. That's part of Manny's strength, that he doesn't want to disappoint, doesn't want to let down or fail those people. And there's not a lot of athletes that get a country behind them, and Manny has that. And in that way, Horn has that. There's going to be 55,000 people in a rugby stadium, that are all going to believe that Horn is going to win this fight. And there's a certain strength to that, in people believing and having that kind of faith. But again, as far as his in-ring, the way that he goes about his business, he's right there. Nothing fancy. You got a guy who's very tough-minded, a physical guy, a guy who's naturally the bigger guy than Manny. I mean, he's been a welterweight his whole career. Manny has moved up many weight classes. I mean, Manny is the only fighter that has won at 8 different weight classes. So, you have an iconic fighter in there in Manny, and you have a kid who's got part of this country that's all behind him. They're talking about 100 million people will be watching television in Australia to watch that fight. I mean, you just don't have the other, I don't want to call it distractions, but the other options you have in our country. You don't have LeBron James. You don't have Stephon Curry. I mean, you have rugby, you have soccer to a certain extent, you have boxing. And everybody's going to identify with this kid Horn and hope that his will can beat the skill of a legendary fighter.
It's Pacquiao and Horn, 9 Eastern, Saturday night on ESPN. And, Teddy, I'm excited for this because it's a great opportunity for the sport. As one who grew up loving the sport of boxing and then watching almost all of the big fights disappear from general view and going over to pay-per-view, I'd like to just hear your take on it. It may sound self-serving because here we are sitting here working for ESPN, but I mean this in a larger sense. What can this do for the sport of boxing to have the number of people that might be exposed to this thing that wouldn't necessarily have gone out and paid for a fight? And what is the roadmap for Pacquiao if he wins on Saturday night, and he's certainly favored to do so? Where does Pacquiao go from there?
Yeah, it's not self-serving at all, Mike, because, quite frankly, if somebody threw a microphone in front of me, being who I am in the business of boxing, to ask my thoughts on it, I would say what I'm going to say right now, even if I didn't work for ESPN and wasn't fortunate enough to have worked for ESPN, as I have been fortunate for the last 20 years. But it's good for boxing. I mean, look, the pretty simple way of putting it, boxing in the most recent time of its great existence, which has been around 200 years, longer than any other sport, it was, in the 80s, it was tremendously successful. I mean, tremendously popular, very healthy time for the sport. What's the formula for that? It was on network television. That's what it was. People identified with the fighters. You didn't have to go to pay-per-view. You didn't have to wait a year to see a good fight. You saw on ABC, Wild World of Sports, you saw every Saturday, sometimes on Sunday, you saw these great fighters, whether it was Duran, Ali, all those fighters, and then it went away. Now it's coming back. And to come back on ESPN, to where everybody has ESPN, where it goes into 120 million homes, and for people to be able to see it for free to the point that, I know it's a package, and I know that, it's people have to get it, but for the most part, you think of ESPN almost as free TV. It's because it's part of everyone's package. It's something that everybody is familiar with, and So when you're going away from where people are paying $70 for pay-per-view, and look, I even throw Manny in there. When you go back 2 years ago and you had Manny and Mayweather in what was the biggest promotion ever, threw 4.5 million people to pay-per-view, and they charged $100. People said, you can't charge $100. Well, they did. And 4.5 million people came out and bought it and made it the largest grossing fight in the history of the sport. And they were disappointed. The fight failed to come up to the expectations of the promotion, of what people thought they were going to get for their $100. And now people get a chance to get a fight with one of those fighters, an iconic fighter, a legendary fighter, and they get a chance to see it on ESPN. It's almost like a payback to the people that now you don't have to go out there and buy it on pay-per-view. And you get an opportunity. He can't fight that much longer. I mean, let's be honest about that. So you get an opportunity, and he's still at a place where he is far from being gone. He's not gone. He hasn't dissipated physically. If there's any dissipation, it might be from the emotional standpoint that I touched on it earlier. He's not always putting his foot on the gas pedal all the way to the floor because he's a little bit more cerebral now. You know, he's got a lot of things going on in his life. You know, he's a senator in his country. He used to be a congressman. So now he's a little bit more thoughtful about his approach. But he's an iconic fighter with the kind of combination of athletic abilities that I talked about before that you don't see in many fighters. So, again, it's a chance for the boxing fan. It's a chance for the sports fan to see this fighter on ESPN, not to have to go to pay-per-view. And it's a chance for the sport to be relevant again. And I hate to say that about my sport, but I have to be honest, because sometimes it's only relevant when it's kind of got the Super Bowl mentality, where when there's a super event, everybody comes. Everybody watches boxing. Everyone. All the movie stars, they all want to be front row. Everybody wants to go there. And it becomes an event-driven sport. This is bringing one of the top names, one of the top 3 names in the sport to ESPN, where it doesn't have to be that way. It becomes almost like you're saying boxing is back where it belongs, on normal television, at a time where everybody can enjoy it, where it doesn't have to be once a year sort of a Super Bowl setting. It can be what it used to be. Big fights available to the public. And it can only be healthy to the sport. At the end of the day, you want to have, obviously, a competitive fight. But right now, all the lights are shining on the sport of boxing again. And that's nothing but positive news for the sport.
Totally agree. Teddy, we're really looking forward to it. We'll see you Saturday night from the land down under. Pacquiao and Horn coverage starts 9 Eastern on ESPN and on the ESPN app. Enjoy it, Teddy. We'll see you when you get back. Thank you.
All right, fellas.
I agree with everything you just said. And I've worked at ESPN 21 years. So if I say this is great for boxing and it's great for ESPN that this is going to be out there, the people are just going to look at me funny and say, sure, of course you're saying that. But it is genuinely true, and he is right. And Mike Golic Jr., you're not old enough to remember what he's talking about. But I remember sitting in my house watching Ray Leonard fight Roberto Duran in the No Mas fight. I didn't have to go someplace to watch that. We didn't pay money to watch that. You just sat in my house and watched the fight, and it was one of the most famous and iconic fights of all time, featuring 2 of the most famous and iconic fighters of all time. So that's what the sport was, and that I'm not suggesting this makes it that again, but it's a step back in that direction, which I think is a good thing.
Accessibility is important in all sports, and this is no exception.
Daddy, where do babies come from?
Honey?
Mommy went to the store.
Oh, well, you see, there's a mommy and a daddy, right?
Right.
And see, when they call Geico, they could save a bunch of money on car insurance.
Oh, really? And that makes them happy?
Yes, that makes them very happy.
That's good.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we could have this talk, Sunshine.
Geico, because saving 15% or more on car insurance is always a great answer.
That's Mike Golic Jr., who's out of his mind. I'm sorry, anything that we had planned here has to now cease, has to now stop, and we have to pick up the conversation where it just took us. So we're doing Grill Golic Jr., hashtag Grill Golic JR, and it's actually trending. And it's been great fun. We're having fun, great questions.
No coincidence, by the way, that Grill Golic Jr. is trending at the same time as why I'm banned from Arby's.
Well, have you been banned from Arby's?
Only in 15 states.
Okay, fair enough. So all that is funny and fine and well and good. And as you know, as your mother once told you, everything is funny until somebody gets hurt. And now someone has been hurt. You very famously on this program knocked the movie Rocky. The original Rocky, you suggested you don't think it's a very good movie.
Yeah, no, it's a bad love story, masquerading masked with good boxing scenes.
All right, so that really bothers me because I love that movie. I think it's a great movie, but I was willing to live with that. But just now, so one of the Grill Golic questions for those of the rest of the country that just tuned in was name another masterpiece, sort of jokingly, as they're saying, that hence using the word masterpiece, that you think is overrated, and you knocked one of my favorite movies of all time, Hoosiers. Are you comfortable, once again, with the usage of the word trash?
Trash, yeah. It's trash.
Hoosiers is trash?
Look at the cover. I mean, just look at the artwork for that movie and tell me you can take it seriously. It's like a bootleg Field of Dreams cover right there. It's terrible.
It's an older
Gross.
movie. I'm not defending the movie poster, but it's timeless. It's a true story, which I love true stories. The scene where they make the shot and Dennis Hopper's jumping up and down in his hospital room, if that doesn't bring tears to your eyes, then I don't even know what's inside of you.
I cry at really well-done Kleenex commercials. Didn't do it for me. Didn't move the needle.
All kidding aside, and because I know I'm saying this in sort of a joking around way, you really find Hoosiers to be overrated.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Name a sports movie you love.
Well, I mean, listen, if we're going to go basketball movies, like I would put He Got Game above that, White Men Can't Jump. Like, those are all infinitely...
comedies. I mean, White Men Can't Jump is a comedy. It's a different genre. I like it, too.
Yeah.
But I mean, as far as... Give me, like, a real sports movie. I mean, White Men Can't Jump is a comedy that uses sports as its premise. Hoosiers is about a basketball team.
He Got Game is about fathers and sons and trying to work through a troubled relationship there.
Right. I haven't seen that in a long time, so I can't compare that one as much. How about Remember the Titans?
Big Remember the Titans. For me, the best football movie ever made is The Program. It's the best football movie ever made. I don't even think it's close for a second.
I didn't see that.
Take some time out of your weekend. Set a little time aside. I know you said you got the wife and kids out of the house right now, so in between foot rubs and golf, mix in The Program in there and let me know what you feel.
Could have lived without you mentioning that, but
listen, we're an open book here.
My wife and my kids are away, so yesterday, right after work, I had a little lunch. I went to the golf course. I played golf, and then I was thinking I need to go through all the notes of the day, all the emails, all the stories. And I said, I can either go home by myself and do that, or I can go to the foot rub place and I can do it there. And let me tell you, I spent a delightful hour there, which is where I came up with the idea that we do Grill Golic Jr. today, which I was all on board with until this moment when you told me you think Hoosiers is overrated.
You want to hear something even better? I'm gonna drop this one on you right now. We've been dealing with Woj bombs all day. I got a Goj bomb for you. So, in the Stugatz School of Fraudcasting, the first rule is lie, 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 die with the lie. That's basically the only rule in it. And I've managed to masquerade my way through this whole conversation, never once having seen Hoosiers.
Get out of here.
Oh, yeah.
You just said that because you thought you knew it would aggravate
me. I'm here to introduce chaos into Mike and Mike. I've come to sink the battleship. Never seen it, have no interest in it, though.
I'm not going to lie to you. I could have lived with the have no interest in it, but I'm not going to lie to you. That was so well played that I've made the complete trip 180 degrees from being flabbergasted by you to being very impressed because you did really play that off very nicely.
Again,
it's a great movie.
I work with one of the best liars in our industry every Sunday morning on Weekend Ops. So
it is a genuinely great movie. So I will watch The Program if you will watch Hoosiers this weekend and come back with a full report on it Monday. Well, Monday is a holiday. You're hosting Monday, right?
Hosting Monday and Tuesday.
Okay. So I want to hear the report. So this is a homework assignment. I am insisting, if I have that power, that you watch Hoosiers this weekend and you come back with a report next week.
Daddy, where do babies come from?
Honey?
Mommy went to the store.
Oh, well, you see, there's a mommy and a daddy, right?
Right.
And see, when they call Geico, they could save a bunch of money on car insurance.
Oh, really? And that makes them happy?
Yes, that makes them very happy.
That's good.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we could have this talk, Sunshine.
Geico, because saving 15% or more on car insurance is always a great answer.